At first light, the Japanese women believed the Americans were preparing their execution grounds. The sky was still bruised with night when the guards marched toward them, boots crunching over frost-stiff grass, silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. The women stood trembling in thin uniforms, hands clasped, breath visible in the cold. They had spent the night whispering prayers, writing final thoughts into scraps of paper meant to be hidden in their clothes. Every sound, the creak of wood, the clang of metal, echoed like a death knell. Then came a smell none of them understood. Smoke, not acrid but sweet. Meat sizzling. Laughter carried on the morning air. The execution squad wasn't forming a firing line at all. They were Texas cowboys in worn hats and dust-coated boots, firing up a massive field grill as casually as if it were a Sunday cookout. The women stared, stunned, as the men tended slabs of beef and pork ribs over open flames. Instead of gunshots, there was the steady crackle of a barbecue pit coming to life. And in that moment, everything they believed about the enemy, and their own fate, began to fracture. The wind cut across the clearing, sharp and dry, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and spiced meat. The women did not move. A row of them, perhaps 20, maybe 30, stood silent, stiff as statues, unsure whether this was mercy or mockery. Their eyes scanned the Americans' faces, searching for signs of cruelty, or perhaps the beginning of a cruel joke. But there were none. The cowboys, because that was what they were, seemed entirely absorbed in their work, flipping ribs, throwing logs into the fire, laughing low under their breath. A man in a tan hat even whistled. It was absurd. Just hours earlier, those same women had clung to one another in the dark, whispering the names of their children like mantras. They had not slept, they had not eaten. Their skin was raw from cold, and their minds were bruised by what they believed would come at dawn. A firing squad. Some had torn pieces of their clothing to write final messages hidden near the hem of a sleeve or inside the fold of a waistband. No one had told them their fate, and so they assumed the worst, because why wouldn't they? They had heard stories, tales passed down from imperial officers and prison guards. The Americans were beasts, the stories said, brutes who violated captives, mocked them before death, shot them for sport. At night, those stories had teeth. They bit deep and gnawed at courage. And so, when the guards came that morning and barked for them to form a line, no one hesitated. They obeyed as condemned souls do, not because they believed in rules, but because resistance would only worsen what was already certain. But now, bacon. The fire hissed and popped. Somewhere, a tin radio crackled faint jazz. The American soldiers, unbothered by the stunned women watching them, kept at their task like ranchers before a Sunday feast. One guard, barely more than a boy, noticed a Japanese woman staring. He nodded to her, then gestured to the fire with a grin, as if to say, "Just wait." She flinched. He looked away. Something shifted inside her chest. Something small and buried. Not trust, not yet, but confusion. Confusion that carried with it the beginning of something more dangerous. Curiosity. Was this kindness? Or was this some elaborate method of torment? Had they read too much into the posture of the soldiers, the tone of their voices? Had fear painted the wrong picture? The sky was growing brighter. Trees stood like sentries along the edge of the camp, leaves rustling in the breeze. The smell of meat clung to the morning like perfume. The women still hadn't spoken, but inside their chests a strange dissonance was building. Their stomachs growled, their knees ached. They were still prisoners, still far from home, but in this exact moment they were not dying, and for some that fact was too much to bear. One woman collapsed, not from illness, but from something deeper, more hollowing. She began to weep, the sound sharp and wet against the silence. No one comforted her. They couldn't. Each of them was drowning in her own quiet war between terror and reality, between doctrine and barbecue. That morning, the first fracture appeared, not in their bodies, but in their beliefs. It wasn't the food or the laughter or the smell of coffee brewing somewhere behind the barracks. It was the unbearable weight of mercy. And when the guards finally called them forward, not to be shot, but to be fed, many walked as if to the gallows anyway. Because what do you do when everything you believed about the enemy is served back to you on a plate, hot and seasoned, under a cloudless American sky? You stare at it. You stare until your stomach hurts more from shame than hunger. Then you take the plate, because the man in the hat doesn't look like he's going to shoot you, and you sit on the dirt floor with the others, legs folded beneath you, and eat ribs with trembling hands, unsure if the grease running down your wrist is a blessing or a betrayal. That's how it began. Not with speeches, not with forgiveness, but with a mouthful of sweet meat and the realization that everything you'd been told might have been a lie. For years, they had been taught to hate. The Americans were demons cloaked in human skin, they were told. They desecrated women, defiled honor, mocked the emperor. Leaflets showed crude caricatures of grinning GIs with bloodied hands and bulging eyes. Mothers whispered warnings into the ears of daughters. Better to die by your own hand than fall into their grasp. Captivity was not a failure. It was a death sentence with a longer drum roll. So, when the war turned and capture became inevitable, the fear that filled the women was not abstract. It was engineered. They had memorized the worst-case scenario because they had been trained for it. When surrender came, it did not come with white flags or hopeful eyes. It came with chins raised in forced defiance because even kneeling felt like treason. But here in this camp, fenced by barbed wire and patrolled by men in cowboy hats instead of jackboots, nothing unfolded as expected. The guards didn't leer. They didn't curse. Some even spoke in soft, clipped Japanese, learned from pocket dictionaries, fumbling with syllables like children learning to pray in a foreign tongue. One woman, a nurse named Yuki, recounted how she had braced for the blow when she accidentally dropped her tray in front of a sergeant. The clatter had echoed like a shot. Her body tensed for impact. But the man had only crouched down, helped her gather the mess, and offered her another tray with a shrug. "Accidents happen," he said. She could not speak for the rest of the day. They watched the Americans with guarded eyes, always waiting for the mask to slip, for the cruelty to break through like sunlight from behind clouds. But it didn't, at least not in the ways they had expected. The soldiers didn't laugh when the women struggled to understand instructions. They didn't deny them food or medicine. They didn't leer when the women walked to the showers. Some even tipped their hats. This wasn't kindness. Not yet. It was something more dangerous, unfamiliarity. It unraveled the scripts they'd rehearsed in their heads, and with each small gesture, an offered cigarette, a clean towel, a slice of peach pie slid across a counter, came the same sickening question. If the Americans aren't who we were told they are, then who are we? Their terror did not vanish. It mutated. What began as fear of violence was becoming fear of contradiction, because if they accepted these moments as genuine, they would have to reckon with the possibility that their enemy had been human all along, and worse still, that maybe, just maybe, they had been used. So they smiled politely, they bowed, they murmured their thanks in broken English. But when they returned to their bunks, they lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above, haunted by mercy. And in those quiet hours of early captivity, a new emotion stirred beneath their sorrow: bewilderment. Bewilderment at how the world outside the fence no longer matched the one inside their minds. That, in itself, was a new kind of war. But before the slow unraveling of fear began, before the scent of barbecue replaced the metallic stench of blood and smoke, there had been only ruin. In the Philippines, the world had collapsed not with a single explosion, but in fragments, villages devoured by fire, orders shouted and contradicted, uniforms stained with dust and blood. The women had belonged to a rear medical support unit, nurses, clerks, supply officers, tasked with holding their post until the very last hour. That hour came swiftly and without warning. Their commanding officer had vanished 2 nights before surrender. Some whispered he'd escaped to the mountains. Others believed he had taken his own life rather than face disgrace. In his absence, there was no chain of command, only survival. Ammunition was gone. Rations had run out. A fever was moving through the camp like wind through dry grass. Still, they clung to their duty, bandaging the wounded with strips of their own clothing, praying to gods they barely remembered. When the white flags came out, they were not a choice. They were a consequence. American tanks had appeared at dawn, not in thunderous charge, but as steel beasts rolling slowly through broken terrain, indifferent and unstoppable. The women were ordered to step out with hands visible. No one spoke. No one looked up. A few sobbed quietly into sleeves. And when the Americans descended, boots heavy, weapons pointed, it felt like the sky itself had given way. They were lined up and searched. Some screamed as their packs were taken, expecting the worst. But the soldiers, though stern, didn't strike. One gave a woman a canteen. She recoiled from it like it was poison. The act did not fit the stories. It did not belong in the script. Then came the march. What was supposed to be a short transport turned into a punishing journey through jungle roads slick with mud and decay. The women walked for hours, then days, under scorching sun, shoes disintegrating, socks soaked with blood. Some collapsed and were dragged. Others were hoisted onto makeshift carts. Dysentery claimed one woman before the second night. Her body was buried beneath a fallen palm. They never learned her name. Each sunrise felt like a mistake. Hunger gnawed at muscle. Feet blistered and burst. Yet worse than the pain was the uncertainty. They whispered guesses about where they were being taken. Interrogation camps, labor factories, graves. American guards flanked them but never spoke much. When they did, the words were short, clipped. Keep walking. Rest here. Drink this. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't kindness either. It was something colder, procedure. And procedure could turn to punishment in an instant, the women believed. So they kept their eyes low and their mouths shut. One night, after a thunderstorm collapsed part of the trail, they were halted near an abandoned plantation house. The building loomed like a haunted relic, its windows empty, its walls streaked with vines. The women were herded into what had once been a barn. There, as they shivered in wet clothes, one of the guards approached with a box. Inside were blankets, clean, folded, woolen. He handed them out without a word. Yuki took hers and held it like a weapon, unsure if it was bait or a mistake. But when she looked up, the guard was already gone, walking back into the dark. These were the first cracks in the narrative. Not enough to rebuild trust, but enough to unsettle hatred. Even exhaustion couldn't erase the feeling. Something was off. The enemy wasn't supposed to offer comfort. They weren't supposed to look so ordinary. But then the march resumed, and so did the silence. They were prisoners. Their names were gone. Their country had vanished behind them. All that remained was the long road forward, and the mystery of what awaited at its end. It began with the rattle of metal wheels and the low moan of brakes. They had been loaded into train cars at the port, herded like cargo but treated with a strange, unspoken civility. No shouts, no dogs, no rifle butts. The cars were plain, not cramped, lined with benches, windows left uncovered. No one had expected windows. No one had expected to see. And what they saw as the train pulled inland was a betrayal of everything they had believed. America was not in ruins. The women stared through the glass, necks craning, eyes wide with a disbelief too large for words. Fields rolled past, vast and green and endless. Cows grazed lazily in pastures hemmed by white fences. Children played near silos, chasing each other in circles, their laughter caught by the wind and flung toward the train like music. There were no bomb craters, no burned-out shells of buildings, no soldiers crouched behind sandbags. The war, it seemed, had never touched this place, and that, more than anything, terrified them. Because they had seen Manila in flames. They had seen hospitals turned to skeletons of ash and wire. They had walked through villages where the only sound was the hum of flies and the crackle of dying fires. Their homeland had become a graveyard. But here, the flowers still bloomed. For many of the women, it was the first time they truly understood the scale of what had been lost. It wasn't just battles or territory. It was normalcy. It was peace. As the train curved through quiet towns, they watched couples sip coffee on porches, saw grocery stores with glass intact, and signs written in soft cursive. One woman gasped aloud when she spotted a farmer driving a bright red tractor across a perfect line of corn. They had been told America was decadent, corrupt, spiritless. But what they saw was a country that hadn't suffered, not like they had, and that planted a bitter seed. Yuki turned to the woman beside her, a former clerk named Hana. "They don't look like people who understand war," she whispered. Hana said nothing. She only watched the trees blur past, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. The silence inside the train car was dense, like fog. Each woman trapped in her own thoughts, her own reckoning. Then, hours later, the train slowed. A low whistle blew. The camp was near. They arrived at what looked like a rural outpost, low wooden structures surrounded by fencing. Barbed wire, yes, but not the choking coils they had expected. Guard towers, yes, but with quiet figures leaning on rails, not perched like hawks. The Americans lined them up, read their names, those that had names left, and walked them through the gates. It wasn't what they feared, it wasn't what they expected. There were gardens here, tomatoes, beans, a line of laundry flapping in the breeze. A dog barked once, then wagged its tail. It was not welcoming, but it was not death. The women stood in the yard as the sun dipped low, their shadows stretched long behind, them mingling with one another in the dirt. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what rules applied here. All they knew was that they had crossed into a new world, one where nothing made sense. And the question now was not how to survive, but how to exist in a place where the war, at least on the surface, had already ended. They learned the answer not through violence or deprivation, but through the quiet indignities of unexpected comfort. The first morning in the camp, they were handed new clothes, simple cotton uniforms, soft and unstained, folded neatly in piles on a long table. An American corporal motioned for them to step forward one by one, but his voice carried no cruelty, no impatience, just routine. He gave each woman a bundle containing the uniform, 2 pairs of socks, and a worn but clean sweater that smelled faintly of cedar. This was their first trial. accepting kindness from the enemy. Some took the clothes with stiff hands, barely nodding. Others hesitated, unsure whether to bow or simply walk away. Yuki stood frozen until the corporal placed the bundle directly into her arms. She recoiled instinctively, as if expecting it to burn, but it didn't. It only felt warm, human. Then came the bedding, thin mattresses, wool blankets, and pillows filled with feathers. The sight of them was almost more painful than receiving them. Many of these women had slept for weeks on dirt floors or on the bodies of the fallen, huddled against the cold. Now, faced with softness, their throats tightened. Gratitude felt like betrayal. Comfort felt like treason. Their days followed a rhythm that was both familiar and alien. The Americans had built a schedule: morning roll call, cleaning duties, meal distribution, rest hours, medical checks. It was orderly in a way that felt almost military, but without the constant tension of rank. The guards drifted between sternness and casual conversation, their authority softened by a kind of rural ease. Mealtimes became the second trial. They had expected thin gruel, cold rice, maybe scraps from the soldiers' plates. Instead, they received bowls of hot stew filled with potatoes, carrots, and chunks of beef, bread warm from the oven, fresh fruit, apples so crisp the skin cracked between their teeth, milk, coffee, peanut butter they did not know how to eat. A few cried the first time they were handed a full plate. The shame was overwhelming. Why should they eat like this when their families across the ocean starved? Why should they taste abundance when their homeland had turned to ash? In the medical hut, the contradictions deepened. Doctors examined them with professional detachment, checking wounds, offering medicine, cleaning infections without cruelty or judgment. One woman collapsed from fever and was lifted onto a cot by two guards who handled her as carefully as a fragile relic. Another was given spectacles to replace the pair she had lost during the march. A third received cream for cracked hands that had bled for weeks. Every act of care cut deeper than neglect ever could, because with each small mercy a question sharpened. Were we lied to, or have they simply not shown their true face yet? Fear became a shadow constantly shifting shape, no longer the terror of being beaten, but the terror of being treated kindly at night. The women whispered to each other, voices low and trembling. Some insisted this was merely a tactic, a cruel prelude to something worse. Others, though they dared not say it aloud, wondered if the Americans were simply people. That thought was unbearable. The third trial was internal, the war between gratitude and shame. Each kindness formed cracks in the armor of hatred they had worn for years. They had been trained to see the enemy as monstrous, yet now they were offered soap that smelled of lavender, meals that warmed their bones, and conversations that were awkward but sincere. And lying under their blankets, staring at wooden ceilings illuminated by moonlight seeping through cracks, many realized the same terrible truth. Kindness from the enemy felt more dangerous than cruelty ever could. And then the Cowboys arrived, not in formation, not with orders. They came in pairs, hats tipped against the sun, boots trailing dust, voices twanging with a drawl that seemed pulled from an old Western novel. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were ranch hands, hired locals, and guards who knew more about cattle than combat. And to the women, they were something else entirely, incomprehensible. Their approach to the prisoners was unorthodox, to say the least. One introduced himself as Buck, and offered a woman a piece of beef jerky with the solemn reverence of a diplomat offering foreign treasure. Another, a wiry man named Charlie, brought a harmonica to roll call and played tunes that made no sense to anyone but seemed to amuse him endlessly. They cracked jokes with the other guards, waved lazily at the women, and once even set up a makeshift horseshoe game in the yard. At first, the women bristled. This wasn't how prisoners were supposed to be treated. Where were the harsh commands, the shouts, the threats? Instead, they were met with jokes and grins and questions like, "Y'all gals ever eat ribs before?" It was during one of these days that the barbecue happened again. Not the first shocking feast at sunrise, but a second, more deliberate one, this time prepared not as an act of disarming surprise, but as an invitation. The pit smoked all morning, the smell of hickory drifted over the camp like incense. Slabs of meat sizzled over flame, and laughter echoed from the guard station. Then, like some kind of ritual, the cowboys began calling names. The women, stunned, were summoned forward in groups and handed tin plates. Ribs again, cornbread, baked beans, a slice of watermelon balanced at the edge. No speech, no fanfare, just food, and the unspoken message that they were not forgotten, not ignored. They ate under a magnolia tree near the edge of the compound, the same tree where a few days earlier they had stood convinced they would die. In the shade, they began to talk, not just to each other, but with the cowboys. Language was a barrier, but curiosity built a bridge. One of the younger guards taught a few women how to say "thank you" and "good" in English. In return, they taught him how to bow properly. Another shared a photograph of his horse, a dappled mare named Clementine. Yuki, bewildered, stared at the image for a long time. It was the first time she had seen an American show tenderness toward anything other than dominance. And through these gestures, awkward, small, but sincere, the walls began to crack. The women still carried sorrow like a second skin. They still mourned what they had lost. But in the rhythm of daily life, amidst the scent of firewood and grilled meat, something unfamiliar began to take root. Connection. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was no longer fear. One afternoon, a cowboy tried to teach them a line dance. It was a disaster. Laughter broke out, not the nervous, kind but real, uncontrolled laughter. One of the women fell down and wasn't helped up by a guard. She was helped by another prisoner, and they both laughed until they cried. For a moment, just a flicker in time, they weren't prisoners and guards. They were people. And it was that moment, not the food, not the gifts, not even the comfort, that began to reshape their world. Because the cowboys, in all their strange, dusty humanity, weren't trying to convert them or convince them. They were just being themselves. And in doing so, they offered the most radical act of all. They treated the women as if they still had a future. But the future, when it finally reached them, arrived not with hope, but with the weight of unbearable truth. It came folded in thin envelopes, carried by an officer who walked through the yard calling their names with a strange mixture of formality and gentleness. Letters from home, news inked in trembling handwriting, smudged in places as if the paper itself had wept. The women gathered in clusters, hands shaking as they tore open the envelopes, eyes devouring the words, even as their bodies recoiled from them. The contents were devastating. Descriptions of starvation, of cities reduced to charcoal, of children with bellies swollen from hunger, and elders too weak to rise from the floor. One letter spoke of a village where the only water source had been poisoned by ash. Another described a family burning furniture to survive the winter. And many letters contained a simple, haunting refrain: "We do not know if we will survive." The women read until their vision blurred. Yuki's letter was short, her sister writing that their home had been destroyed in a firestorm, that their mother had died in her sleep, that they were rationing millet and wild grass to stay alive. Hannah's letter mentioned a cousin taken by disease and neighbors who had disappeared into the forests, desperate for anything edible. One woman, usually composed, fell to her knees, clutching the page to her chest, rocking back and forth as if trying to hold together a life that had already fallen apart. And then, almost immediately, came the shame. It struck them like a blow, hard, unforgiving, because while their families starved, they ate meat. While their children shivered in bombed-out ruins, they slept beneath clean wool blankets. While disease ravaged their homeland, American doctors tended to their fevers and infections with medicine drawn from cabinets that seemed always full. Every kindness the Americans had shown them now twisted itself into guilt. The stew that warmed their stomachs, the bread soft enough to melt on the tongue, the sweet scent of soap, even the laughter shared under the magnolia tree. All of it turned bitter, each memory a reminder of their unbearable privilege in captivity. Some refused meals for days, claiming illness. Others took food, but swallowed it with a hollow, mechanical obedience. A few wept silently into their bowls, tears falling into broth seasoned with grief. At night, the dormitory filled with muffled sobs. The cowboys, usually lively and teasing, moved with quiet steps, sensing the shift, but not understanding its full magnitude. One guard attempted to offer Yuki a slice of peach pie, her favorite from previous weeks, but she bowed her head, refusing. He left it on the table anyway, confusion furrowing his brow. The pie remained untouched. Inside each woman, a fracture deepened, a violent tearing between two incompatible truths. They had been raised on propaganda that painted Americans as savages. Yet here they were, receiving food, warmth, dignity, and now they learned that their own people suffered while they lived in relative safety. How could they reconcile that? How could they reconcile themselves? Some clung hard to the old beliefs. This is manipulation. They want to break us. Others began to wonder, quietly, dangerously, what if the lies came from our own side? What if we never knew the full story? Identity became a battlefield. Loyalty became a wound that would not close. They had entered the camp as prisoners, but now they were something far more fragile, women suspended between worlds, between truths, between versions of themselves that no longer aligned. And in this abyss, where past and present collided, one terrifying realization emerged. They were beginning to see the enemy not as monsters, not as saviors, but as human. And nothing, not war, not propaganda, not memory, was more frightening than that. Because once you see your enemy cry, laugh, hesitate, or smile at the wrong moment, something changes. And it did, slowly, then all at once. The war didn't end in a moment of surrender. For these women it was undone thread by thread, over shared moments that no one had expected. It began with small gestures. One of the women helped an elderly guard carry a crate of supplies across the yard, not out of obedience, but instinct. He smiled, muttered something in Texan drawl, and offered her a peppermint candy from his pocket. She hesitated, took it. That night, she unwrapped it like a treasure, split it in half, and shared it with her bunkmate. Another time, a guard named Amos tried to show them how to cook cornbread on an open flame. The flour was unfamiliar, the technique foreign, but the laughter that followed when the bread burned to a crisp was genuine. One woman, cheeks smudged with soot, mimicked Amos's mustache with a line of ash, and made the entire group burst into hysterics. It wasn't about language. It was about rhythm, the rhythm of day-to-day life that slowly began to pulse with something resembling normalcy. Even the chores, sweeping, laundry, peeling potatoes, became opportunities to observe and understand. In the kitchens, they learned that the cowboys liked their eggs over easy and that they could eat chili for breakfast without blinking. They learned that Americans drank milk cold and that salt was added to watermelon. They found it bizarre, funny, but human. On both sides, perceptions shifted. For the Americans, these weren't just enemy combatants anymore. They were women with names, routines, moods. Some were quiet, some defiant, some curious. The guards began asking questions, not about the war, but about Japan. What was Tokyo like? Did they have horses there? Could you grow okra in that soil? The women, cautious at first, answered slowly, carefully, but the questions grew easier. And then one day, one woman asked a question back. In halting English, she pointed to a drawing in a guard's pocket and said, "Your child?" He nodded. A girl, 5 years old. Her name was May. That simple exchange cracked something open. Soon after, a woman brought out a folded piece of rice paper she'd hidden in her boot, the last drawing her son had made before she left. It was just stick figures and a cherry blossom tree, but the guard stared at it with a reverence that surprised even her. In that moment, they were just two parents holding pieces of love preserved through war. These connections weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, they didn't rewrite history or undo loss, but they mattered. They gave the women something they hadn't had in months: emotional agency. For the first time since their capture, they began to make choices, not just to survive, but to engage, to speak, to remember who they were before the war hollowed them out. One woman began humming again while she scrubbed the laundry. Another started to braid her hair. A third stitched a small flower into the hem of her uniform, barely visible but defiantly hers. They were rediscovering identity. Not the one shaped by propaganda or shattered by grief, but something softer, quieter. They weren't ready to forgive. Not yet. But they were beginning to remember that they were more than prisoners. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, artists, teachers, people. And for the first time, that realization didn't feel dangerous. It felt like something to protect, something to build on. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like the video and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more forgotten histories to life. Then the world shifted again. The news came not as a shout, but a whisper that passed from bunk to bunk, from guard to prisoner, like a ripple slicing through still water. The war is over. At first, no one believed it. Not really. The women sat stunned, their faces unreadable, as if waiting for the punchline to a cruel joke. But the evidence followed quickly. The guards' radios switched from coded updates to celebratory jazz. The mess hall served fresh watermelon, and the commanding officer, usually stone-faced, gathered the women and confirmed it plainly. Japan had surrendered. A few women gasped. One burst into tears and buried her face in her hands. Another laughed, a short, sharp sound that startled even her. But most just stood still, rooted in a moment that felt too big to absorb. It wasn't joy, it wasn't even relief. It was something else, something harder to name. The end of the war meant they had survived. But it also meant returning to a home they no longer recognized, a country they feared might not recognize them either. Over the next few days, the camp moved in a dreamlike rhythm. Logistics were arranged. Lists were read aloud. The women were told to prepare for repatriation, by boat, escorted, in groups. But no timeline felt real. It was the kind of waiting that lives between chapters, and while they waited, something precious began to unravel. The cowboys, always so loose-limbed and breezy, moved with quiet heaviness now. One by one they approached the women, not with ceremony, but with small tokens and quiet farewells. Amos gave Yuki a handkerchief embroidered with her name in shaky English stitching. Another guard passed out photos, snapshots of the camp taken with an old camera, the edges curled from heat. One woman received a worn deck of cards. Another, a small music box that still played a broken lullaby. There were no speeches, just nods, glances, a final shared cigarette, a hand resting lightly on a shoulder. Language remained limited, but the meaning was clear. We saw you. You changed us. We'll remember. And the women? They gave what they could. Some folded cranes from newspaper scraps. One drew a portrait of the mess hall and signed it with the Japanese character for peace. A few exchanged addresses, unsure whether any letter would ever reach its destination. But the gestures mattered. In their barracks, they began to pack, not just their belongings, but the weight of what they had lived through. A pair of boots worn through at the heel, a bar of soap carved into a flower, letters, drawings, scars. Hannah carefully folded the American sweater she had received on her first day in camp. She held it against her chest for a moment before placing it at the bottom of her bag, not as a souvenir, as a memory. Yuki kept the peach pit from the pie she'd once refused to eat. They didn't know what awaited them in Japan. Rumors trickled in, ruins, rationing, a people ashamed of surrender. Some feared being branded traitors for having survived too well. Others worried about facing families that had buried them long ago. But they also carried something new, the possibility that the world was bigger than they'd been taught, that humanity could exist in the cracks left by destruction, that they were more than what the war had tried to make of them. When the trucks arrived to take them to the docks, many turned for one last look at the camp. It wasn't paradise, it wasn't home, but it had become a strange kind of in-between, a place where enemies had become people, where identity had cracked and reformed, and where the first seeds of healing had been planted. They boarded the trucks not as who they had been, but as who they had become. The sea voyage home was quiet. There were no bands, no flags, no cheers, just the steady hum of engines and the murmur of waves against steel. For weeks, they drifted across the Pacific like ghosts returning to a world that had moved on without them. But it wasn't until their feet touched Japanese soil again that the true weight of return settled in. Tokyo, once alive with neon and laughter, stood in shambles. Streets were hollowed by bombings. Buildings leaned like broken teeth. The air carried a smell of ash, mold, and something else they couldn't name. Entire blocks were flattened into memory, and where there had once been homes, now there were tents. In the station square, they saw a girl, no older than 10, combing through trash for something to eat. A boy nearby held his baby brother in a rice sack tied around his chest. No shoes, no parents in sight. The women stared, but the children didn't look back. There were no parades for these returning soldiers, no welcome, just suspicion. Some whispered that those who surrendered were cowards. Others called them contaminated, touched by the enemy's hand. But worse than the judgment was the silence. No one wanted to hear what they had seen. How do you explain being treated with kindness by the very people you were taught to fear? How do you admit you were fed while your family starved? Yuki returned to her old neighborhood, only to find her home burned to the foundation. A neighbor recognized her, stared, and simply walked away. Hannah's parents were gone, buried in a cemetery with no names carved on the stones. Her brother, once a schoolteacher, now stood in ration lines for days just to bring home flour and miso. They tried to speak of the camp, of the cowboys who had taught them to laugh again, of the food, the routines, the quiet gestures, but no one wanted to hear it. Those stories didn't fit the narrative, so they folded them up like old letters and tucked them away. But something had shifted, deeply, irrevocably. They found themselves noticing things others didn't. The way a stranger offered tea with two hands, the way a mother held her child's hand as they walked past the ruins, the way small mercies lingered even in devastation. They volunteered in kitchens. They taught children to sew, to read. They told stories, not of war, but of resilience, of the strange beauty that bloomed in the most unexpected places. And when they gathered, just the few of them who had made it back, they spoke of the barbecue, always the barbecue. They remembered the smoke rising into the dawn light, the clatter of metal trays, the sharp tang of sauce, the way the cowboys had laughed too loudly and handed out food like it was a ceremony. It wasn't the meat or the music that stayed with them. It was the shock of being seen as human. They were no longer soldiers, no longer prisoners, no longer tools of empire or victims of it. They were women who had crossed an impossible bridge and returned not untouched, but awake. In the years that followed, they married, aged, raised children who never knew the war. They became quiet pillars in their communities, carrying truths they rarely shared. But sometimes, when asked, they would speak of the camp. And when someone asked what it was like, what America was really like, some of them would pause, smile faintly, and say only, "Not what we expected." If this story moved you, make sure to like the video and comment below, telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.